Right, good morning, happy Sabbath. Welcome to the College Church in Lancaster, Massachusetts. I'm Roger Prather. My partner today is
Ralph Gifford.
And Pastor Ram is away at Camp Winnipeg this weekend doing a mission seminar. And so Ralph and I are unsupervised. We're going to try our best to get ourselves into trouble this morning. But before we get into trouble, I'll start with prayer and then we'll jump right into it. Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity to come and study your word. We thank you for the Sabbath. We thank you for the sunshine and the warming weather. Please be with Pastor Ram and any church members or church leaders who are away at Winnipeg this weekend in the seminar that they're producing. Please give us your Holy Spirit to enlighten our minds as we study your word. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, Ralph, I've been away for 2 weeks. I've been away from here for 2 weeks. I just got back from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, so I haven't really benefited from the conversation that people have around the Sabbath school lesson, so I don't really have a whole lot of ideas in my mind, but I think this week's lesson is an interesting one because in your email, you sent me an email last night, and I thought it was interesting because I think there's maybe something you and I can talk about, because you mentioned more than, different covenants, how God deals with people through different covenants. And I've taken, at the beginning, I took the stand that there are no different covenants, it's all the same covenant.
Okay.
So we can talk about that if you want. But we'll start with the memory verse. I'll read the memory verse as like a sort of a baseline for us. It comes from Genesis chapter 17, verse 7. I, God, will establish my covenant between me and you, Abraham, and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. And so this week we're talking about God's covenant with Abraham. Do you have any baseline thoughts or introductory thoughts about God's covenant with Abraham?
There's potentially a lot of irony here. First of all, God says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. There's going to be, your descendants will be more than the stars. How many children does Abraham have? None. 0. And then God comes along and says, okay, I'm going to give you all this land for your descendants. If that's not irony, your descendants, again, how many children does Abraham have? 0. And then time passes, Abraham is 99 years old, and God comes along and says, you know that part of your body that is important for having children? And I'm going to make you a great nation, and this is going to require you to have children? Well, cut off the end of that part of your body. At this point, you're starting to ask, does God have a warped sense of humor? He promises Abraham the land for his descendants with no children. He promised, and he says, all right, this is your covenant. Now go have children. I've just had you go through circumcision. Now go have children. Huh? And then, of course, just adding further, finally, at 100 years old, Abraham has a son. And then a few years later, God says, okay, off him. Go sacrifice him. So when I ask the question, did God choose Abraham because of merit? The one thing that Abraham needed to fulfill all of this was children. God actually adds insult to injury by saying, I'm going to change your name, father of many nations. So Abram has to walk around with this name that's been applied to him that God has given him, saying, Father, people must have been looking at Abraham saying, you are absolutely nuts. Believing in this God who says he's going to make of you a father of many nations, changes your name to reflect this. Then you have circumcision on top of all this. You claim you're going to have all this land. It reminds me in some ways of Noah preaching for all those years while building the ark. And what it says to me is that this covenant, which is a blessing, is part of the reason why God chooses Abraham is because of his unfitness, in a sense. To choose Abraham to make a great nation when he has no children. He's not, it's quite clear, he's biologically incapable of having children. And it's that very unfitness that seems to meet God's requirement. Anyway, I've spoken way too much.
No, not at all. I think you bring up a lot of good points. The irony aspect of it, I think if you look at the whole biblical narrative, you know, God works with irony. He chooses, excuse me, he chooses to work in and with situations where his purpose or his power or his authority is demonstrated. And I think Abraham was probably, like as you point out, a perfect example of that. I would just add maybe one thing to what you said, and that's maybe God chose Abraham because Abraham was the only one who was listening. Because when you talk about, we know that God is a universal God, right? God's the God of everything. Every covenant before this one, and this is a really important thing to point out, every covenant agreement between God and human beings before Abraham was made essentially with the entire human race, right? Noah was a representative of the entire human race. Adam represented the entire human race. In Abraham, you have this one specific group of people. And I think that it's possible that, where is Abraham from? He's from Ur. Ur was this like urban center.
New York City.
Many gods. It was like New York City, right? And so God's voice is going out there. God's trying to communicate. We know that he communicates with other people because we have Melchizedek, right, out in Jerusalem, what will become Jerusalem, who was a priest in the service of Yahweh. So we know that there are other people who have heard God's voice at this point, but here God's message is going out through different channels, but for most people it's being drowned out. Abraham's the one guy that sort of inclines his ear a little bit, and then God starts the irony where people are going to be like, your God asked you to do what?
You pick up and move, leave your family, leave your people, leave your nation, go off someplace, not hop on a plane.
No, not. But, that's a valid point. Go someplace completely different and start a new life.
Yeah, and so I'm going to give you the land. Yeah, if we miss the irony, I think we miss something. And I think once we get the irony of the situation, it sheds a completely different light on the meaning of circumcision. This is not to say that there are not other meanings. I think this is one of the wonderful things about the Bible, is that there are often 3, 4, 5, 6, multiple levels of meaning. But the irony here helps bring out, I think, another level of meaning that we could easily miss if we don't see the irony.
Yeah, what I think I'm going to say something that I've said multiple times in different quarters since we started this, but when you read the Bible, especially when you read the Old Testament, it bears repeating over and over again. One of the lenses that you have to sort of put on and understand is that everything that is put into the Bible about God, what God does and says, is done in order to distinguish him from the pagan gods of the surrounding nations. And so a lot of times, you adopt these rituals or practices were adopted. So circumcision existed, prior to Abraham. There's archaeological evidence and textual evidence that places like Egypt and things like that, but nowhere was an entire society circumcised. It was usually limited to a select group like priests or some sort of dedicated religious group or something like that, or a royalty or things like that. But then you go forward, and we have the benefit of the New Testament, which is something that people didn't have at the time. But when they talk about, well, actually later on in the Old Testament, I would make of you a nation of priests. Well, it makes sense if the whole nation's circumcised at that point. And then to go back using the New Testament as well for Abraham and the irony, how does, the book of Hebrews describes Abraham as he believed God and it was counted towards him as righteousness. So here you have this God telling Abraham to do all of these, what at the time would have seemed like maybe some sort of wacky things. But Abraham went ahead and did it anyway because he trusted God. And in Sunday's lesson, we'll try and stick with that as an outline. Sometimes it's really hard. But in Sunday's lesson, it talks about God's name and what God's name would have meant in that circumstance. I don't know if you kind of delved into that a little bit, or...
I didn't spend as much. I was caught up in a sense, going in some sense connecting back with the irony, but with the significance of God changing Abram's name to Abraham.
Yes.
But I think there are many points to draw out from the names. Just before we get into the names, which there's a lot to get into there. Back on circumcision.
Yeah.
And the practice of circumcision in other nations. Typically, circumcision would have been performed or done at the age of 13. And at this point, it's a test. It's to symbolize transition to manhood, but it's also, there's a lot of emphasis on being brave and stoic as this very painful thing takes place. And so it signifies the merits of the person on whom the circumcision is being performed, that they have achieved a certain level of merit to become a man, that they can be stoic and this type of thing. Now, what God comes along and says, to circumcise the male children, at what point? 8 days. Now, at that point, the child has merit. The child has no say, will have no memory. There is nothing about circumcision of an 8-day-old baby that says that this is an act symbolizing that the meritorious achievements of the child. So in this sense, the way God uses circumcision, something that, as you pointed out, that is being practiced by other people, is to signify the complete dependence. Going back to the irony before, when God comes along to Abraham at 99 years old and says, you're going to be a father, and I want you to go get circumcised. This is like God saying, when God institutes circumcision, it's to symbolize the complete dependence on the power of God. When the child is circumcised at 8 days, again, it's symbolizing the complete dependence on the power of God. Mm-hmm. It's not something the child has control over. So, what happens so often when God does something that is important, that is valuable, that is symbolic or otherwise, when God creates a blessing, we, or the devil, comes along and distorts it. So the distortion that happens around circumcision is that it comes to represent we are the chosen people. And this creates the sense that we have merit. So they turn the symbolism of circumcision is ultimately representing the complete dependence on God to we are chosen because we have merit. We're special, we're unique, and that is a complete distortion, which is why even though in Genesis 17, God says to do this forever, we get around to Acts 15 and they say, dispense with it because it's been completely corrupted, the symbolism, the meaning of it by that point in time. To just bring this home in another little way, when we talk about covenants, one of the types of covenants that gets talked about is the suzerain vassal type of covenant. Where God says, if you're loyal to me, I will protect you from all of these nations. Now, to illustrate how this kind of caring, loving notion can become corrupted, I'll say something that you'll quickly get the point. All right, if you're loyal to me, I can't do it on the microphone here, but I want to do the Godfather voice.
Oh.
If you're loyal to me, I'll give you protection, right? And Roger, you work in the prison system. This kind of thing goes on in the prison systems all the time. There's power structures that develop. There's people within the prison system. You give me loyalty, I'll give you protection. This is a corruption of what God does. And what so often happens when God, whatever approach God comes, the devil will always try to corrupt it and reverse it. And so this suzerain vassal kind of covenant is another example where we corrupt. Circumcision, the meaning, corrupted. Anyway.
No, I'm glad you brought up the suzerain vassal part because it does talk about, where in the lesson it does, I forget which day it was. Wednesday and Thursday, it kind of goes over when God, it sets up they create this sacrifice. So the way the Suzerain Covenant worked was you cut an animal in half, and you put
self-maledictory oath.
Yeah, what's that?
Self-maledictory oath.
Correct.
Yeah.
If you and I were going to do a covenant, we would cut a bull in half, and we'd set it up with a space in between. And you and I, different accounts are different depending on the culture, but you and I would basically hold hands with one another, and we would walk in between the animal, and basically make promises that says, if either one of us doesn't fulfill our end of the bargain, we're going to wind up like this animal, And when it comes time for Abraham and God to sort of seal the deal or cut a deal, that's where the term cut a deal comes from, cutting a covenant. When it comes time for them to sort of like go through the formal motions of establishing the covenant, only God walks in between the two halves of the animal. Abraham is an observer. It says he goes into a deep sleep, and then this darkness and dread comes over him, and he sees God as a flaming pot of fire go pass between the animals himself and say, I swear by myself. Right? So God essentially says, this is a gospel promise. God says, if I don't fulfill my end of the bargain, I will go to the point of death to fulfill the end of the bargain. Tying that into God's name, right? So God's name, Yahweh, right? God reveals himself to Abraham as Yahweh, the self-existent one, the one who is, the one who's being in and of himself. Okay, so the being who exists in and of himself. Even all the pagan gods are contingent. They rely on something else for their existence. And God says, I don't rely on anything else for my existence, but I'll suffer the penalty of death in order to fulfill my covenant. Like that's irony.
Yes.
And Abraham probably doesn't understand at the time exactly what that means. But all he knows at the time is like, okay, I know what the covenant is. Like, I'm a Middle Eastern chieftain. This is what we do to cut deals in my culture. Here I have this divine being making a deal with me, but I'm not allowed to walk through. Basically, I don't suffer any penalty for not fulfilling my end of the bargain, but God's going to suffer the penalty for me. If I don't, that's ultimately what happens. Abraham probably didn't get the idea, but we're building, and that's where like multiple covenants, I think there are multiple covenant instantiations, but each one sort of builds on the previous one in order to reveal a larger picture.
Exactly. God works with us where we are, within our culture, within our stage of development. And I love what you said there. You know, Abraham is a chieftain. In a sense, you could say he's almost like a warrior chieftain, which is very consistent with the power structures of the time. A slave owner, which again, very consistent with the time. And God starts with where he's at. God doesn't come at him with things that are so far beyond his concept that he completely misses. Now, some of it he doesn't get, certainly. That is true. God is foreshadowing, I love the way you pointed that out. And that's for our benefit. That just shows that God sees the end from the beginning, that he's able to both simultaneously work with Abraham using methods that Abraham will understand, while at the same time telegraphing thousands of years forward that'll help us. Where we can get off track is when we overly literalize and say, well, so God, just to give an example, so God did this covenant with Abraham. Abraham was a slave owner. Therefore, God endorses slavery.
Right.
This I think is another example of a distortion.
Yeah.
We have our own faults, shortcomings. God works with us. You're an elder at the college church, and until this last nominating, they always had this rule: the elders always had to be perfect. But in order for you and I to become on the board, they had to lower the standards. Okay, can you tell I'm using a little bit of irony here? God works with us the way we are, imperfect. Abraham was imperfect. In some sense, I'm going to say, almost idolize Abraham. When Paul writes about Abraham in Hebrews, I think it's chapter 11, the heroes chapter, there's this almost, putting him up in glorious life, like he's almost a perfect. Abraham is a very flawed human being, and God works with him with those flaws in wonderful ways.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up, because when we read, for example, in Hebrews chapter 11, we're kind of going off on a tangent away from Abraham, but when you read, maybe not, when you read in Hebrews chapter 11, there's a lot of not very good characters. You go back and you read them in Hebrews 11, and then you're like, well, I don't remember who that character was. And you go back and you read about some of the things they did, and think of Samson, right? Samson took a donkey's jawbone and slaughtered thousands of people. There were some, Gideon, all these Old Testament characters. And the point is, when we talk about faith, we want to think that we're perfect, right? And that's sort of where, if you put it into Abraham's context, Abraham knew what he was. And God met Abraham at the point that he was. That's really, I think, the one of the points on Wednesday's lesson where it talks about there's 3 stages to the covenant: the approach of God to man, the call to human obedience, and then the divine promise. There's this, God goes to people where they are. He finds Abraham in this large pagan city of the time. He calls him out of it. He doesn't say, okay, once you leave that behind, now you have to change all of these things. No, he gives him one task at a time. All right, circumcise yourself, and sacrifice your son, and all these different things. But at each stage, what really distinguishes Abraham from those surrounding him is that, and that's what Hebrews chapter 11 is really getting at, is that when God asked them to do something, or God told them something, these people they believed God. They believed what God said. They trusted God, right? And in the Greek, I don't know about the Hebrew, but in the Greek, the word for faith is trust. It implies a trust, a back and forth trusting relationship. Back and forth trusting relationship. And so when we talk about where God meets people in perfection and all these things, really it's God asks people to do things, or he imparts certain pieces of information to things. Just think about in your own Christian experience, there are points, I mean, I can think of there are points where you have these aha moments, like, that's what God was talking about. Okay, now I understand. I believe you, God. I'm sorry. And you move forward, and you move forward. But we forget that that's what we're supposed to do, the trusting part. But that's what Abraham does, and like each step of the way, God's meeting him, like you said, in his context. If God would have come down and said, I don't know, if God would have just revealed from the beginning to the end, Abraham probably would have rejected him. Remember, Abraham's a pagan, and his family remains, I learned this from Dean Davis, and it never clicked in my head, but they remain semi-pagan. He's like, Abraham's family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, remained semi-pagan in their manner of thinking. They couldn't help but be otherwise because of the circumstance they're in. So Abraham initially, there's thousands of gods for Abraham to choose from, right? But he stuck with this one because God made, every step of the way, God made promises and he fulfilled them. And in the lesson, when it comes to, what's the relationship between faith and works, it's not that our receiving of the benefits of the covenant are contingent on our behavior. Like, well, you sinned, like your example of the church board. Well, we know that you're a sinner, so you can't be an elder, you can't be a deacon, or you can't be whatever. That's not how it works. It's, God meets us where we are. That's not an excuse to remain what we are, but God meets us where we are. And what obedience is just continually moving along the path of trusting what God says. Like, to put it into a specifically Adventist context, I think of like down south, I grew up in a very conservative Adventist environment, and there would be, you'd have a Revelation seminar or Daniel seminar, and you get people that come in and they would study and then they'd be baptized. And we have this sort of expectation that when they come up out of the baptismal waters, whatever it was that they were before that day is just magically erased, and they've become new. And we use that language, you become new. Well, that's not really what it is. Like, they might have had bacon for breakfast the day after they were baptized. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, but that doesn't eliminate them from being participants in the covenant. Being the covenant, what with Abraham, what the covenant relationship shows is that it's just a continual trusting of God. It's not that, we talk about, we'll probably get to it. I haven't looked ahead in the lesson, but, Abraham and Isaac, we talked about it either last quarter or the quarter before. It must have been the quarter before. But it was believing. Because think about, the stages along the way. Okay, Abram to Abraham, where you're going to have children. You're going to go from exalted father to father of many. Abraham had every reason not to believe God because of his age, particularly because of his wife's age, and he believed him anyway, right? And then he finally gets the son that's going to help him, be the descendant who fathers the many nations. And then God says, take him up on this hill and kill him. I want him as a sacrifice. That's, Abraham. But how is he? He just believed, right? He trusted God. And each step of the way, what God is doing, and I'll say it again, is he's distinguishing himself. God is distinguishing himself from all of those other pagan gods that Abraham would have had to choose from. And now in 21st century, of course, we don't believe that Baal and Asherah and Zeus or whatever actually exist. We know that they're figments of people's imaginations, or mythic motifs that people come up to explain things, however you want to put it. But we still have other things to choose from. And the question of obedience is not, well, you didn't obey the letter of the law. It's, you're not trusting me enough. That's really what obedience is obedience is, are you trusting me enough when I tell you don't eat bacon for breakfast, or whatever it is in your own life that you struggle with, because we all have those things, and Abraham certainly did too.
In one of the forgotten parts of Genesis, God does a job interview with Abraham before he calls him out to Canaan. He goes through the interview and he says, now tell me about your experience traveling to foreign countries. Tell me about your understanding of theology. Tell me about, of course I'm making all of this up, right? God did not require Abraham to have the proper understanding of truth. God did not require Abraham to have the right theology. God did not require Abraham to have the proper understanding of him. What God did was work with a relationship with Abraham, as you were bringing out. And starting with that relationship, and as you said, Abraham, he was basically a pagan. That's what his culture, that was his understanding. That, by the way, continues, because it's only in, so you have Isaac, and then you have Jacob, and remember that Jacob's wives had idols and, hid away idols and this kind of stuff. I mean, even that's just a second generation away, and they still have the idols that they're carrying around and preserving and so forth. They did not have a clear theology or understanding, and that was not important. When Jesus comes down to Matthew 25, I think it is, separating the sheep from the goats, as much as you have done it unto the least of these. And then he also adds this little caveat, and as long as you also have the proper understanding of the state of the dead, and proper understanding of the Sabbath, and the proper, the seal. No. That's not how it works. And yet, one of the traps or the distortions that we fall into, Sabbath is enormously beneficial for furthering that relationship, developing that relationship with God, coming deeper into relationship with God. But instead, what we end up doing is distorting it so that we create some sort of a theological box to contain God. And whenever we do that, and we do the same thing with covenants, we're looking for ways to put Aslan, if I could shift my metaphors here a little bit to suddenly drawing a
C.S. Lewis, Tales of Narnia.
Right, is Aslan a tame lion?
You read my mind. He's not a tame lion.
Not a tame lion. And so often we want to have a tame lion and put this tame lion in a theological box to whatever. And God is busting out of the boxes, tearing apart the boxes. Is not a tame lion.
But that's a pagan, and this is something that we talked about significantly, the pastor and I, in the last quarter with Isaiah, is that what our temptation constantly is, and you see it specifically in terms of pagan religion, polytheistic religion in the Old Testament. But what that basically does is you're treating God like a pagan god. Because in a covenant relationship with a pagan god, it's, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to sacrifice this lamb so that you have whatever it is. Different gods require different things. And in return, you're going to promise to do this for me. And it was a very, very much a business-like relationship, right? We would call it sort of like a contract, And that's what God does, is completely breaks the mold. He's like, look, I don't care what kind of box you want to put me. I don't care, you know what I mean? Like, I'm going to do, and that's where you get to like God's name. I am who I am. God's basically saying, like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And there's nothing you can do to stop me. You're either going to trust me and get on board, or you're going to go your own way. And even when you go your own way, I'm constantly going to try to remind you about the covenant that we had, the covenant that I'm going to be the one who passes through the two pieces, sort of thing, to put it into the Abraham context. And this is something that when we talk, you set up the covenant, when you say God's everlasting covenant, that's God's everlasting covenant. God's everlasting covenant is, I created this whole thing. When I created, I made a commitment to it. And then each stage that, like within your email to me last night, like each stage along the way is God demonstrating in a different way, and often in a more complete way, because you have the benefit of hindsight at that point. Abraham had the benefit of being able to perhaps learn, we don't really know, but learn about things like Moses and other, the primordial history of Genesis. Did I say Moses? I meant Noah. Sorry. Abraham would have had the benefit potentially to learn about things like Noah and things like that, because he interacted with Melchizedek and things like that. So it's not like God was completely unknown prior to Abraham, but at each stage of the way, God is building on the prior experiences. And that's what you can sort of shrink it down, and this is our own lives as well. When we think about these stories and how do we apply them in our own lives, well, that's kind of how it works. Like we met God at a certain point in our lives, and each step of the way we start to think we understand. If you come from outside the church, you sit down and you do all of the little lessons to learn all the fundamental beliefs and everything, and then you get baptized and you think like, now I have this complete understanding. But what in life actually works that way? I mean, like, I still don't know my wife, and we've been married for almost 20 years. Your job, your career, whatever your hobbies are, you're always constantly learning something new as you experience, because that prior experience is something that you build off of. And that's what Abraham's relationship was with God, and that's what the biblical narrative is in terms of the human relationship with God, and that's sort of what we go through individually in our lives.
Well put. So I've been married 45 years. I finally have my wife completely figured out.
So I have 25 years left, is that what you're telling me?
I get away with that because she's online at a different Sabbath school, I hope. Otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble. It doesn't work that way, does it? This is, I think, one of the wonderful things about the way God has created us, that we are continuously growing, developing, learning, and God keeps working with us as we're going along. When we think about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, created perfect, what does that mean, created perfect? Because God comes down to walk with them in the evening to do what? To continue the development, to teach, to show, to learn. Well, does that mean that they were not quite perfect? There was still more development to go? What is the meaning of perfection, in that context? And so God is far more mysterious than my wife. So much more to learn. And God must just, this kind of connects back to the irony. God must laugh. As a parent, I know that, and as a grandparent, I laugh at some of the things that I would see my kids do when they were young, or my grandkids do. God must laugh as he sees us, doing stupid things, but also having those aha moments like, oh, I see, I get it. This is something I didn't see. Must have been marvelous. God must have been having such a wonderful time with the Apostle Paul. While he was Saul, deeply studying all of the theological tenets, really nailing it down, getting it all figured out. And of course, they were at that time, Judaism was systemizing, they'd been coming through this process of there was the Mishnah and all the writings just continually to refine and define and put everything in a box. And Paul is becoming a master of that. And then God comes along and says, or I should say, I keep saying Saul should be what the name I'm using at that point. God comes along and blows up the box.
Yeah.
And what does Paul become? Paul becomes the one is probably the greatest at throwing out the box.
Right. Like here's this box here's this book that I thought I understood, and I have to completely refigure how I understood it. If I could use I'll use a baseball analogy. So imagine, God's the pitcher and you're the batter, and you're standing in the batter's box, and God starts winging fastballs at you, right? And then you finally hit the fastball, right? And you think, okay, I got it. And then God throws a curveball.
Yeah.
And you go, God, what was that? Like, well, you got the fastball. Now you have to learn to hit the curveball. And then once you get the curveball, he throws a changeup.
Oh, changeup. Okay, and then I come along with a knuckleball.
Oh, yeah, then you can throw the knuckleball. Then you throw the slider. And, you can keep going on and on and on. But once you learn to hit each ball, at some point, then God's going to switch to pitching left hand. And he's going to start over again with the fastball. Just when you thought you had them all down, God's going to show you that you don't. And at each time, you know what I mean? To continue the baseball analogy, you go, God, you keep switching the pitches up, and God's always going to say, yeah, but they always land in the strike zone. Right? That's kind of how it works. And that's what he's doing with Abraham. And I think as we continue on looking forward into the covenant, we sort of have to keep that kind of idea in our mind, is that, in other denominations and other sort of theological formulations in Christianity, when you talk about covenant, God, they'll, depending on which flavor of the church you're tasting at the moment, you'll hear people talk about, covenant of grace and covenant of works. And then, there was this time when everything was based on what you did. Your salvation was you had to walk the line. And then God sort of changed his mind and said, obviously these creatures can't walk the line, so I'm just going to have to I'm going to have to be merciful. Well, no, it was always grace. It was always grace. So all the covenants are grace. It's just that each stage shows a development in not how God changes, right? Because, doctrine of the perfection of God is that God is changeless, right? It's not how God changes, it's how we change. As a species, over time, that's Genesis to Revelation, but then we take that and we apply it to our lives, and we all know this. I mean, like, I'm older now, I'm past the age of 40. That's like the magical number. That's when you start to realize, like, man, I'm stupid, like, man, from 19 to 29, I thought I had it all figured out, and then, God spent the decade of 30 to 39 teaching me that the world is absolutely not what you think it is. And now I'm just kind of, you resign yourself to that fact, and that's what we have to do. That's what the Bible is sort of teaching us to do, is you have to that's what Paul had to do. Hey, Paul, you think you got this all figured out? Guess what? Bam. What do you think about this? And Paul had to reassess. Mm-hmm. And that was probably a very difficult thing to do. You got to really sort of start to stop and think. These characters in the Bible, they're not just, Abraham didn't just wake up one day and go, all right, I think I'm going to follow this guy, this God. It probably did not happen that way. This is probably that point where he gets called out of Ur, that probably was in process and being developed for decades at that point, right? And each stage, each character as we move forward in this quarter, I think, is we have to constantly keep, they're always in the batter's box. You go back to my baseball analogy. We're never going to leave the batter's box. Never going to leave it. We're never going to make it to first, right? Because God's always going to keep showing us, like, you haven't quite figured out, I've got an unlimited repertoire of pitches. And he's just going to keep, and it's not God trying to fool us, it's God trying to acclimate us to the way the universe actually works. And he wants us to know that we haven't gotten it all figured out so that we trust him, which is why Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. All right, I'll stop the sermon now. But I just, I think that's probably the most important thing that we can really draw from the lesson. We can get into the minutia, and we can talk about the name changes, or we can talk about, like lines here, the roots of Hebrew words or whatever, and that's all interesting and fun, but on a practical level, that's usually the pastor. See, I'm filling the pastor's role, because I'm usually the one like going off on like, well, the Hebrew root and the conjugation, blah, blah, blah. But you have to be able to apply it practically. And applying it practically is recognizing that it's a process.
We'd like to pick up, you mentioned covenant of grace, covenant of works.
Yep.
Okay, throw a little bit of a rock at Paul, because I think he uses the expression new covenant, which is kind of where this gets started. When you really look at the covenant language, what's happening here with Abraham and with God, all along it's about Abraham's complete powerlessness to bring this about. As we talked about earlier, it's a fact. Abraham and Sarah are biologically incapable of having children.
Mm-hmm.
That is a fact. I mean, they've been married for decades, no children. So, yet, somehow, because of, and I think especially because of circumcision coming in at a later part of this notion starts to take hold that it's a covenant of works. It's based on us doing certain things to then merit God's favor. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. No, that's a distortion. All along, the way God does us, again, picking up the point you made earlier, God alone walks between the halves of these animals. God is trying to show all along that it's a covenant of grace. It's a covenant of God blessing us, God doing things for us, God taking care of things. Let it go. Stop worrying, in a sense, is what happens. But we are so intent on being gods ourselves that we want to grab the steering wheel or take control, and that's where, as God does these things, it transitions into this covenant of works, if you will, which is, it misses the boat. It was a distorting of what God was trying to do. And I don't want to take Paul too much to task for the new covenant. He's, again, trying to help people see things, break through their entrenched mindset. He uses certain language to try to break through. And so when we get into this situation, well, Paul says the new covenant, therefore the old covenant was bad or wrong or something like that. No. that comes from our over-literalizing the exact language. This is a relatively, this kind of approach to Bible study has come about to a large extent, like in the last couple of hundred years or so, last maybe 200-300. Well, in some sense, it started with Luther.
Yeah, Reformation.
Yeah. It distorted the way we look at the Bible. When we step back and say, okay, let me stop being quite so literal and try to look at what is the point? What is God trying to say here? What is Paul trying to do? Then it helps us avoid that trap of saying, oh, well, Paul said it's new, therefore the old must have been wrong. Well, if you say that, then in effect you're saying, well, God messed up when he gave the old covenant. And suddenly we have a wrong understanding of God, and we've missed the boat.
Well, to be fair to Paul, he didn't originate that term. Jeremiah did. Jeremiah prophesied.
That's true.
Prophesied that there would be a new covenant. But what distinguished the new from the old was that the law would be written on the heart. So that it's really easy to, it's not, you walk it back a little bit, all right? So now you go from, all right, let's look up what I'm supposed to do, and then you want what God's would put in a practical sort of perspective. What God's trying to do is he's trying to get us to a point where our character is developed to such a point that we wouldn't need to reference back to some sort of written document or written text in order to understand what it is we're supposed to do. And that's really where Paul's going. What Paul's going, when he talks about like the law and how it's a law of sin and so on and so forth, it's because when we do this with the Bible, don't take what I'm about to say the wrong way, but we do it with the Bible. We'll go like, well, where in the Bible does it tell me that I have, how do I learn, I don't know, make something up? How do I use my cell phone? Well, the Bible's not going to tell you how to use your cell phone because the Bible doesn't know that cell phones exist. There's no such thing in the biblical context. And I mean like in terms of character, not technologically. But we're always constantly trying to reference back to the Bible and say like, well, where in the Bible does it, if I had a nickel for every time, like where in the Bible does it say that we have to do this? Well, the Bible doesn't specifically say everything verbatim, explicitly, that we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be applying it. Again, Jeremiah, I will create a new covenant, and in that covenant, my law will be written on the people's hearts. They're not going to be referencing back. And again, tying it back into Abraham, you can see this kind of development in Abraham. You see it in Sodom and Gomorrah, because here's Abraham bargaining with God, saying, I know your character. I've learned something of your character. I've learned enough of your character to know that you're not just going to indiscriminately destroy a city because of what some of its inhabitants did if there are righteous people still in the city. That's beyond comprehension for a God like you, for your character. So Abraham's sort of like at that development. And ultimately, again, refer back to Genesis. You brought up Genesis. Refer back to Genesis. What made Adam and Eve perfect? I wouldn't say they were perfect in a divine sense. Like, we're not going to become like miniature gods at the second coming. But they reflected maximally the image of God that was created in them. And that's sort of where, when we talk about perfection and we talk about new covenant versus old covenant, I would say a new covenant perspective. Christ is the new covenant. Christ in himself demonstrated a perfect understanding of God's requirements for conduct, and I don't like putting it that way because it sounds legalistic, but like I'm big on natural law. So I would say that perfection in the new covenant sense is living your life consistently with creation, or God's intentions for creation. And that's sort of, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Even Jeremiah talking, I thank you for bringing up Jeremiah. When he talks about the new covenant, again, I think he's using language to try to break through to people. Mm-hmm. Because if you think about the way God worked with Abraham, it was on the basis, as you've been pointing out, it was on the basis of relationship. That relationship, the building the trust, that communication. For God to tell Abraham, take your son Isaac, your only son and go to sacrifice him. And for Abraham to do that, that could only take place in the context of a very strong relationship. And that relationship really implies that the law was written on Abraham's heart, as Jeremiah said. So again, I don't think it's really a new covenant. It's not that that God suddenly said, okay, I give up on doing it by the rule book.
Right.
And now we're going to, in the future, going to do it by writing the law on your hearts. It was always intended to be a heart-based, a relationship-based law. But, and again, so many of you here are parents, had children, and we understand that when children are young, there's a lot that they don't understand, so therefore we must provide clear rules,
Right.
boundaries to help in the development. As they get older, then they begin to better understand the reasons for the rules. The law increasingly becomes written on the heart, so to speak. Deb and I have been, for fun, we've been watching the Andy Griffith Show.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And this one, in the first season, this one episode, Andy, the sheriff, is trying to explain to Opie the relationship between the rules and, in a sense, the thinking or when to apply the rule and when to disobey the rule, in a sense, because of a higher rule. So Andy says to Opie, he said, let's say there's a pond and there's a sign that says, no swimming in this pond. So that's the law. That's the rule. No swimming in this pond. And one day you come by and you see that somebody out there in the pond is drowning. They broke the law. They're in that pond. They're drowning. Do you let them drown, or do you break the law and go in and rescue them? You jump in, you break the law, you go swimming to rescue them. And Opie says, well, you break the law and go in and rescue them. And this, to me, was a great illustration of that when the law is written on our hearts, we transition from being legalistic followers, blind followers of the law, to understanding that the law, as Paul says over and over again, other writers in the New Testament talk about love is the fulfillment of the law. It is the key to unlocking how to follow the law. And that story with Opie, it's loving to go and rescue that person who is drowning in the pond. So therefore, rescuing that person is the ultimate fulfillment of the law. The law then is written on my heart when I have love that fulfills the law. It's the same thing that God is doing with Abraham. And I think, to your earlier point, the other nations have, with the other gods, it's this sort of transactional notion. I offer a sacrifice, you do something to appease you as a god, you do something good. I do something for you, you do something for me. God comes along and says, throw all that transactional thinking away. It's not about you doing certain things to appease me and then I do something for you. It's about I do something for you and then I do something for you and then I do something for you because I love you. And all I'm trying to get you to understand is I want a relationship where you love me too. You come to trust me. And this is what God is doing with Abraham, is showing Abraham over and over again it's about love, it's about trust, it's that relationship. To further bring this out, what happens? Abraham starts to give up. He takes matters into his own hands. He says, okay, well, I'll father a child with Hagar. And God says, that's it, Abraham, out of the pool, no more. I withdraw everything I said. You're no longer going to be. No. God reinforces and says, that I see you're headed for the covenant of works, trying to, you're moving away from that trust. I want to reinforce the trust. And again, he comes out with another ironic statement,
Right, and I thought you're going to waive a time limit pretty soon, but I think that's an important point, because I think what we have to remember, what's really important to remember, and it's easy to forget, is that Abraham didn't have the law. That doesn't come till Moses, right? And then we also sort of make this mistake in terms of like hermeneutics and in our biblical interpretation. We sort of treat Abraham as like this like covenant of grace, and then Moses comes along, and there's this centuries-long interregnum where it's all about obedience to the letter of the law again, and then Jesus comes along and it's grace again. No, that's not the point. The point is Abraham did it through basic relationship, right? We don't know exactly how Abraham and God interacted, but God used the civilization that Abraham came from, as we already talked about, the pagan, and he used that, and he used that to get him to understand. And it was, one family. This was like one tribe that Abraham was overseeing. So there was really no need for all that written law. It existed at the time. You had Hammurabi and things like that around this same period. But Moses comes along, it's an entire nation. So now you have all these people, and like the teenager analogy I think is great, because my children are just getting into their teen years, and they think it's probably, I remember being a teenager, it's all about rules. My parents want this. No, I give you rules so that you understand the higher principle. And that's really where we're driving. I think that's where we'll move forward as we continue on the covenant. But I just got the 2-minute warning. And so any final thoughts, Ralph, before we, 30 seconds? It's hard.
So in every lesson, I like to look for another facet of God's love. I think of God's love as like an infinitely faceted diamond. We talk about diamonds having facets, different faces. I think of God's love as being like an infinitely faceted diamond. And when I look at this lesson, you can come at this lesson and there's a lot of wrong conclusions you can reach. But once you start to see it showing God's love in action with Abraham, does great things with Abraham, and Abraham is completely dependent on God for that.
That's a good lesson to have, complete dependence on God. All right, it's time for us to wrap up. Would you close with prayer for us?
Heavenly Father, just as you were patient with Abraham, despite his failings, you persisted, you led him, you helped him to grow and develop. You do the same for us. You continuously lead us, help us to grow, to become what you want us to become. You see the potential for us. We fail to see our own potential. You see it. You want us to grow. And you're patient with us, and your love keeps helping us to grow. Dismiss us now with your blessing, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.